Hi, this is a quick introduction to testing RxJS. We're going to go over the test scheduler that's built into RxJS, and we're going to talk about the adapter, the wrapper that we use for our applications here at MX, and we'll talk about some other things as we go. So on the left, we've got a test for an epic. That epic looks like this. And an epic is a function that takes an observable, this action's observable, also state, and then any injected API utilities, and it returns an observable. So that makes it kind of a nice thing to test because you're writing a function, you're testing a function that takes an observable and returns an observable. So as you can see, this observable takes this actions stream. That stream already exists. It's a hot observable, which we'll talk about again in a minute. And it filters that on a particular action type, and then it flat maps that. It makes an AJAX call, and it maps the response from that AJAX call into either this action, if it's a success, or this action, if it is a failure. And so the flat map flattens that out, and so this then returns the result of that XHR request with the success or failure. So that makes epics pretty easy to test. Basically, we're calling our epic here. We're passing in those three parameters, and then the test framework is going to subscribe to that observable for us, and then we're checking with this to-be call that it emits the thing that we expect. In this case, a success, and then down here, an error. So I'll dive into that in a little bit more detail in just a minute. But let's talk a bit about the RxJS test scheduler. So if you go to the RxJS 6 and 7 website, and you come in here to Reference, go to Overview, go to Testing, and go to Marble Testing, this is the documentation that you're going to want to read to learn about how to test with RxJS. This first example, you can see that we're importing this test scheduler, and then here we're running that test scheduler constructor with a callback function that's going to give us a scheduler object. Now I'm going to circle back to what this is because this is how you bridge any given test framework with this built-in test scheduler. Here at MX we're using Jest, of course, but this lets you bridge any other testing framework. So I'll show you our bridge because this is a little indirection and it can be a little confusing. But for now, just keep in mind that we get this scheduler back. Now, a lot of the RxJS operators, like interval, for example, will take an argument called scheduler. Often is the last argument to the function. And what scheduler lets you do is it lets you change the way that this operator deals with time, meaning you can have something like a request animation frame scheduler so that your observable will emit values on this request animation frame timetable, which is something specific for browsers and other Rx backends. Java or C#, they're going to have schedulers that are specific to dealing with threads or dealing with processes or dealing with other internal mechanisms for those platforms. But then there's also this test scheduler. And what the test scheduler does is it virtualizes time. So oftentimes when you're testing something like an interval, right, if you're emitting something every second and you're doing that for 30 seconds, you don't want to write a test that's going to take 30 seconds to run. So this lets you virtualize that time so that it runs instantly, but it's faking those intervals internally. This also lets you deal with asynchronous things like promises and that kind of a thing, set timeout. Now, speaking of promises and set timeout, something to keep in mind is when you're running an RxJS test, you cannot use things like promises and set timeout within here because those are not subject to this scheduler argument. And so they will run asynchronously whereas the test scheduler, the point of the test scheduler is to make asynchronous things run synchronously. So that's why we don't use promises directly in these epic tests. So going back to this example, you can see that once you've got that scheduler, you call this run method. It takes it passes your function this object that contains various things that you can destructure. You're not likely to use all of them, but you're likely to use one or two, picking and choose for a given test. And then it's got this expect observable argument that gets passed in, and that's what you use to actually check your observable with the expected output. So let's boil it down. Let's get rid of what we have here and just kind of hollow this out. Okay. So we just want kind of a minimal implementation. Now, what we're doing here is we are creating an observable that we're calling input, and that's a hot observable that immediately emits a value called A. And we're testing that the output of this observable, the thing that this observable produces, is going to be a value called A. So that's kind of the idea there. Let's see, I got this backwards. We're going to test input, and we're going to test that our input is output. And output is not an observable, so I'll get rid of that demarcation. So we're testing that this input observable produces this output. The string syntax is something called a marble diagram. So if you've seen something like RxJS marbles, rxmarbles.com. This marble diagram is a way to say if you've got this stream and this stream and you use the merge operator, it will produce a stream that interleaves all of those values in exactly the same time that they happen on each stream, just interleaved. So it's a way to kind of visualize a stream. If you are a visual person, these can be very helpful. If you're not a visual person, you don't need to use them. But these tests are written using an ASCII representation of a marble diagram, as you can see here. So keep in mind that's what you're trying to build. Prettier might make this a little difficult to line those streams up. So do what you can with function calls and parentheses and other trickery to get those to line up. It will also ignore white space. So if you wanted to do something like that so that the A's line up, that is a valid test. There we go. All right. So let's talk about hot observables briefly. We can destructure hot and cold from that object that gets passed in. A hot observable is an observable that is producing values regardless of whether or not anybody's listening. A common kind of example to talk about a hot observable and a cold observable is a movie versus a home video. So like with a movie, if you miss the first part of the movie, if you go into the theater after the movie's already started, you've missed the first part of the movie. There's no going back, that's it. Whereas with a home video, you pop a VHS in the VCR and you hit rewind and you play the movie from the beginning. And then the next time you put the VHS in the VCR, you hit rewind and you start from the beginning again. So in more concrete terms, a hot observable would be something like a WebSocket connection, right? It's going to be producing values whether or not you're listening. It's an event listener, like a click event listener or a mouse move event listener. Those events are going to be firing regardless of whether or not you have an observable listening to them. Once you subscribe, you don't see any of the values that have happened in the past. You just see the values that are happening from then on. Whereas with a cold observable, it's something that the act of subscribing triggers the behavior like an AJAX call. When you subscribe, it triggers the AJAX call, and that goes out and it returns its value. When you subscribe again, it triggers another AJAX call. So we can demo this by doing something like RxJS ajax.ajax, and we'll call api.github.com. Okay. So this is going to return us an observable. And of course, nothing's happened yet. If we jump over to the network tab, you can see that no network requests have been sent, but subscribing to this will trigger the AJAX request. Then if we subscribe to it again, it'll trigger another AJAX request. So the act of subscribing triggers the behavior, and it starts over from the beginning that way. Interval is the same way. Interval starts counting from 0 when you subscribe to it. Then if you unsubscribe and then subscribe to it again, it'll start counting from 0. Once again, it's a cold observable. So keep that distinction in mind. When we're talking about epochs, this actions argument is a hot observable. There are redux actions going through the application all the time, regardless of whether or not you have an epoch listing for them. So this is a hot observable, which is why in the test I've created a hot observable here. One other thing to note about hot observables is they're often multicasted. Not always, but often. Multicasting is repeating the same result or the same value to multiple listeners. So obviously this XHR call that we're making is not multicasted. Whenever we subscribe, it makes a new API call, and then the results of that come through to a listener. But we can multicast it if we want to, and we can do this with any observable that we have by putting share on the end. Oop. Pipe. There we go. And so now, if we were to subscribe to that, it would trigger one AJAX call. Let's demo that by subscribing to it multiple times. You can see, just like before, we get each individual observable to emit a value, but we've only triggered one AJAX call, and it has multicasted the response to the 3 subscriptions that we have going. So that's something to keep in mind if you've ever got multiple listeners, or if you're ever reusing the same observable more than one time inside of a stream, like with take until. You know, if you want to listen to an observable and then take until that observable produces a specific value and then unsubscribe, right? You're listening to that observable more than one time. All right. Back to this. Let's finish our minimal proof of concept here. So with this string syntax, if you do not give this a qualifier, it will actually output in the stream the string value that you put in here. So you can see it was expecting a B, but we gave it an A, right? So it's actually sending that string through. But if you wanted to change that, then there's a second argument to both the hot function and the toBe function, where you give it an object and you can say A is foo and B is bar. And let's go ahead and inline this to make that relationship just a little bit more clear, so that the function signature that hot and cold take is the same as the function signature that toBe takes. So if we save that, we're sending an A, but we're expecting a B. But actually, you can see that we sent a foo. So this A was translated into a foo for us. So if we were to change that to a a B, it'll send a bar. But that's still not quite what we're expecting, because we're expecting B to be a bar. There we go. Now our test is passing again. Let's see. There's a lot to be said about this marble diagram syntax. Each one of the dashes in this is what's called a frame, and the RxJS testing docs go into this in more detail. But just keep in mind, it doesn't exactly correspond to real time. With default parameters, a frame is 1 millisecond, but I think it's useful to not think of it in terms of milliseconds and just think of it in terms of frames. So you can see that it takes a frame, frame 0, frame 1, frame 2, and then it emits. And down here, we're listening for it to emit a B, and we're not particular as to when it emits that B, but we could be more particular if we were to say do something like that. Then it would not emit a B. It would emit the value that we were expecting, which is bar, but you can see that it was expecting that to happen on frame 4, but it happened on frame 2. So that's how frames work. In addition, you can do things like a pipe to say this is when the stream ends, there's no more values coming, and that can be useful to test sometimes. You can also say, this is particularly useful with hot observables, is you can say this caret character is when somebody subscribes. So if I were to save that, you can see that we expected something on frame 4, so there's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but we got something on frame 2. So we're not counting from here, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're counting from where the subscription actually joined that hot stream. So keep that in mind with this ASCII syntax, and definitely look through the RxJS docs for more information about this ASCII syntax. Okay. In the case of epics, we generally don't care about that level of detail. Generally speaking, we're just making an AJAX call and checking the response. So if the hot observable emits immediately and the test is looking for that value at some point in time, that's usually what we're looking for, just that input and output. All right, so let's talk a little bit about testing epics more specifically. So we know how we can create an observable using this hot function inside of this run method. Well, that observable that we're creating in the context of redux-observable is going to be a redux action. So we're not just emitting a B value here, but rather we're emitting something which is a type of some action with a payload. Foo equals foo kind of a thing. So that should look familiar as a redux action, and that's the thing that we're going to pass in to our epic here. So as you recall, our epic is listening to the action stream, and then it's filtering on this chart's load action before it does its thing. Oftentimes, when you're writing epics, the actions themselves are just a function, like this one, that returns an object. So they don't actually do anything by design. They just return the object. Maybe they take some function parameters and they intersperse that into the object, like you can see here. If you give it the chart argument, then it'll put that into the payload for you. So oftentimes these actions are very simple. So oftentimes what I'll do when I'm testing them is, instead of recreating the action from scratch, like we could here, I'll just call the action. There's no value in testing that function, so I'll just call it actions load chart data. Right? Load chart data, actions load chart data. So if I save that, we should see that that payload come through. let's see, we were expecting to match object, but we got undefined. Oops. Forgot to say that that's what B is. B is that value. There we go. So now we've got our redux action, and what our actual epic is going to do is that's going to take, that's going to pass this of type, and then it's going to trigger an AJAX call, which is going to return either success or error actions, follow-up actions. So that brings us to this third argument, which is a nice way to patch into all epics certain kind of common dependencies. These are almost always going to be API kind of utilities. So if we look at the store, there's this function here called create epic middleware, which is going to get past this this object of dependencies, and these are all of the API utilities that then are available for destructuring in any epic that needs to use them. So this is a nice way to just kind of pass something in that's used frequently, but more important, it's a nice way to be able to override this value. Since this is a function call, this allows us to do a little dependency injection and to override this API call with something else whenever we want. So that way we don't have to do any crazy mocking or anything like that. We can just pass in the thing that we want. And in this case, the thing that we want is we don't need to actually make an AJAX call, right? The API utility itself has its own tests. For this, we're just saying if the epic succeeds, we expect it to get translated into the success action, and if it fails, into the failure action. So that's where this comes in, that we were using before. In this case, we don't want to throw the error. We want to do of, and it really doesn't matter what value we put in here because we're not testing that value at any point. We're just saying this is an observable that produces some value. Okay? That's not an error. So down here in our test, we're calling this action, and then we're expecting the epic that we're testing to produce a success, a not error, right? So let's do that now. Let's actually call our epic. So our epic is going to be epics that we're importing here, and then it's going to be load chart data. And as we've seen already, the epic takes the actions observable, this second argument, which is the redux store, and then this injected API utility. So we've already got our actions observable right here. So input, feel free to call that actions if you prefer. We're not doing anything with the second argument. And then we've created this this context object there, which makes it so that we are just bypassing that AJAX call. So the epic is a function that takes an observable and these other two arguments and returns an observable. So that's where our epic comes into play. The underscore placeholder is for the function definition, not the function call, of course. All right. So we were expecting a bar, but we received this redux payload with success, and this is the action. So that's almost what we're testing for. We just need to update what the value that we're testing for is. And in this case, we're using the to-match object of Jest's assertion suite. And I'll get into why we're using that in just a minute. But for now, we just need to test for an object that, that matches the same shape. We don't care about any additional keys. So in this case, the thing we're looking for is that action. So the type that we care about is going to be action types, and then this success action. So let's take a look at what that should be real quick. Let's see, load success. There we go. That's the one that we're testing for. Let's see, we received this, what we were expecting undefined. Action types out of dispatcher's charts. Charts load success. Chart list load success. Let's see, why does it see that as undefined? Oops, I made the same mistake I did above. I need to tell it that that's what the B is equal to. Let's see, syntax error, so RB, oops. RB is equal to an object. There we go. Not quite. There we go. Prettier agrees that is valid syntax, so we should be good. All right, there we go. And there's our passing epic test. So let's see. We've talked about hot and cold observables. We can get rid of this argument since we're not using it. Let's talk about the run method, and then we'll talk about our own custom wrapper. So the run method that we see here and that we saw in the documentation here encapsulates the Rx specific tests. Now, these tests run asynchronously for reasons that are beyond the scope of this video. Suffice it to say, when you define observables in here, and when you run this expect observable function, it is scheduling tests to be run in the future. It is not actually running them. So that makes interspersing regular jest tests like expect true to be false problematic. So if I were to put that there, you can see that this test is now failing. This assertion is failing, and it did not even get to this test, even though it appears above in the code. The reason for that is those tests are scheduled to be run. They're not run synchronously. We can force them to be running synchronously if we import this flush function and put that in there. So that will synchronously execute all of the tests that have been scheduled to run, and then block until they're finished before moving on. So now you can see that it ran this first test first. Let's showcase that by making this test fail. We can see that test fail before it gets to the bottom assertion. So yeah, so now it executed this test first because we have this flush in place. If I get rid of that, it'll fail on the test below it again, as we saw. So keep that in mind. Everything that's inside of this run method is asynchronous. Generally speaking, I'd say it's probably a code smell to try and use that flush operator to make synchronous things. It's going to have a specific use case, so feel free to use it if you need it. But otherwise, put your tests around this call to run instead. Okay. Last, let's talk about the wrapper that we have around bridging jest with bridging RxJS. So in this example we saw, in order to get this scheduler object, we had to call this constructor and pass in this function, and this function does that thing that bridges the gap between the test suite and Rx. So in this case, it's bridging chai. In our case, we're bridging jest. So we have a utils and a test.js inside of this utils. And what this does is this is bridging jest, and there's some instructions here. Now this is a bit of an indirection, due in no small part to an unfortunate naming choice. So you can see here that there's three methods that we can call: toBe, toEqual, and toMatchObject. And these correspond to the jest assertions of the same name. toBe, of course, is jest's way to test identity. toEqual is jest's way to test equality. And toMatchObject is jest's way to match the shape of one object with another object. In all cases, those three things are exposed here. So expect_rx is that util that we were just looking at, toMatchObject. And so what this is saying that toMatchObject is going to be the jest assertion that we are actually calling when we call this toBe function in expect_observable. The reason this is an unfortunate naming choice is toBe is used by an awful lot of testing suites, including jest. And when we're calling toMatchObject, we're obviously not calling toBe at all. But that is the name that was chosen for the RX6 test scheduler. So that's a bit of an indirection here and something to watch out for. This toBe is specific to expect_observable, and because we've got this wrapper, we're actually calling jests toBe. Okay? So we can change this like that if we wanted to use this toBe to map to jests toBe. In this case, we're testing a redux payload, and so we're looking at the shape of those objects. We're looking to see that it's got a type set to this value, and we don't care about the payload for this particular test. We could, and we could just add the payload here if we wanted to. Right. But for this test, we just care that it succeeds and doesn't fail. These tests are pretty easy to write. They're pretty easy to get started with. So feel free to copy the existing tests and to write tests for any epics that have not yet been tested. Eventually, you'll get to a place where you're writing tests for more complex epics that are doing more than just doing an AJAX request response. When you run into those, you're going to make a lot of mistakes as you're getting familiar with this. Go through this whole document from start to finish. Certainly hit me up if you have any questions or somebody else on the team. And yeah, just expect for it to take a little while for you to write your first test for your first few tests for an epic. Just keep in mind that the payoff is worth it for the kinds of value that epics bring in terms of just managing really complex async interactions in a really succinct and top-down and readable way. The payoff is worth it. So writing tests might seem like a little painful at first with the indirection and just kind of the difficulty of wrapping your head around what's synchronous and what's asynchronous. Just keep in mind, like Rx itself, the end payoff is going to be worth it. So good luck. Thanks for watching.